Hello guys, welcome to Story Cave, where truth hides inside every tale. Before the world learned to write, stories were carved in hearts, not paper. They were whispered under moonlight, of love, betrayal, survival, and grace. And though time has changed our tongues, the lessons still burn the same. Here in Story Cave, we don't just tell stories, we remember them. Because every tale is a mirror of who we are. Today's story is about a woman, a marriage, and a lie that felt like love. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a tale, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments what you think. Now, let us remember together. There are many ways a marriage can die. Some end with screaming, plates thrown, doors slammed, words sharp enough to draw blood. Others die quietly, like a candle burning down in an empty room, unnoticed until the light is completely gone. Ifeoma's marriage was dying the second way, and that made it harder to fight. You cannot battle what you cannot name. You cannot revive what refuses to announce its death. She used to know the sound of Chike's laughter, deep and easy, the kind that made her chest warm. She used to know the weight of his hand on the small of her back as they moved through their Lekki apartment, a touch that said, "I'm here, I see you, you're mine." But those days felt like they belonged to different people, younger versions of themselves who still believed that love alone could sustain a home. Now, for years into their marriage, Ifeoma found herself living with a man who occupied space, but offered little else. He came home late from his logistics company, smelling of diesel and distance. He ate the meals she prepared with polite gratitude, but little conversation. He slept on his side of the bed, careful not to touch her even in sleep, as if her body had become foreign territory he no longer had clearance to explore. Ifeoma told herself it was just a phase. Work stress, financial pressure, the normal ebb and flow of marriage that everyone warned her about. "You've got this," her mother had said when Ifeoma first confessed her worries. "Marriage has seasons. Sometimes it's summer, sometimes it's harmattan. You just weather it and wait for the rains." But Ifeoma was tired of waiting. She was 29 years old, living in a beautiful apartment in one of Lagos's nicest neighborhoods, wearing the ring she had dreamed of since girlhood, and yet she felt more alone than she had ever felt as a single woman. At least then, loneliness had been honest. Now it wore the mask of companionship, which made it crueler somehow. She tried everything she knew. She cooked his favorite meals, jollof rice with extra peppers, the way his mother made it, egusi soup so rich it could resurrect appetite from the dead. She bought new lingerie, expensive lace that made her feel foolish when he barely glanced her way before turning to his phone. She initiated conversations about their future, about children they might have, about dreams they used to share, but his responses came in monosyllables, his attention always somewhere else. "Not now, Ifeoma. I'm tired. Can we talk about this later?" Later never came. Later became their most frequently visited destination, a place they planned to go but never actually reached. The night everything changed, like all the others. Chike came home at 9:47 p.m. She knew because she had been watching the clock, waiting, wondering if tonight would be different. He greeted her with the same tired smile, the same, "How was your day?" that expected no real answer. They ate in that companionable silence that people mistake for comfort, but are actually just two people who have forgotten how to speak each other's language. After dinner, he retreated to the living room with his laptop, and Ifeoma stood in the kitchen washing dishes, watching her reflection in the window above the sink, and she barely recognized the woman staring back. When had she become so small? When had her presence in her own home started feeling like an apology? That's when the thought arrived, not gradually, but suddenly, like lightning splitting a dark sky. She had been scrolling through her phone earlier that day, mindlessly consuming social media, and she had seen a post from an old friend. The woman was glowing, her husband's hand on her very pregnant belly, his face full of such open adoration that Ifeoma had felt it like a punch. The comments below overflowed with congratulations, heart emojis, promises that this baby would change everything, make everything better. And Ifeoma remembered the early days of her marriage when relatives had pestered them about children, and Chike had pulled her close and said, "One day, when we're ready. But for now, I just want you." He had meant it then. She had felt it in the way he held her, the way he looked at her like she was enough. When had she stopped being enough? The lie formed itself before she could examine its architecture, before she could measure its foundation or calculate its eventual collapse. It felt, in that moment, like the only bridge left between who they had been and who they had become. A baby. The promise of a baby. Wasn't that what everyone said brought couples together? Wasn't that the magic ingredient that could transform indifference back into intimacy? She dried her hands on the kitchen towel, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape the cage of what she was about to do. She walked into the living room where Chaik sat bathed in the blue light of his screen, and she stood there until he finally looked up, a question forming in his eyes at her unusual stillness. "Chaik," she said, and her voice sounded strange even to herself. Too high, too bright, carrying a tremor she tried to disguise as emotion. "I need to tell you something." He set down his laptop, and she saw his body tense slightly, the way people brace for bad news. "It's okay to feel scared," she told herself, even as she prepared to step off the cliff. "I went to the doctor today. I've been feeling strange lately, and I wanted to be sure before I said anything." She watched his face, watched confusion give way to something else. Hope, maybe, or just heightened attention, the first real focus he had directed at her in months. "Chaik, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them like a spell, and for one crystalline moment, Ifeoma saw what she had been starving for. His face transformed, the mask of exhaustion cracking, falling away to reveal something raw and real beneath. Joy. Unmistakable, uncomplicated joy. He stood so quickly he nearly knocked over his laptop, crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, and pulled her into his arms with a force that drove the air from her lungs. "Are you serious?" He whispered into her hair, and she felt his body shaking, felt the wetness on her shoulder that meant he was crying, and her own tears came then. Partly from relief that she could still make him feel something, partly from the terrible knowledge that this feeling was built on sand, and partly from grief for what they had become, 2 people so desperate for connection that lies felt necessary. "Yes," she whispered back, the word of betrayal and a prayer all at once. "Yes, we're going to have a baby." And as Chaik held her, as he pulled back to look at her face with an expression she hadn't seen in over a year, as he laughed that deep, easy laugh she thought she had lost forever, Ifeoma felt the lie settle into her bones. It felt warm. It felt like winning. It felt, for that brief and shining moment, exactly like love coming back from the dead. She had no way of knowing that resurrection is God's work, not ours, and that what we try to raise with our own hands usually comes back hungry, demanding, and impossible to control. The lie had been born, and like all living things, it would need to be fed. The days that followed the lie were the sweetest poison Ifeoma had ever tasted. It's a peculiar thing, how deception can sometimes feel more real than truth, how a well-crafted fiction can resurrect what honesty allowed to die. For the first time in 18 months, Chaik came home early, not once or twice as a novelty, but consistently, deliberately, like a man remembering he had something worth rushing toward. He would walk through the door at 6:30 p.m. instead of 10 o'clock, and the sound of his key in the lock would make Ifeoma's heart leap with joy and plummet with dread in the same breath. Joy because this was what she had been craving, his presence, his attention, his care. Dread because every moment he spent doting on her pregnant belly was another moment she borrowed against a future she could not repay. He became tender in ways she had forgotten men could be. Gentle, attentive, present. He would place his hand on her still flat stomach and speak to the child he believed was growing there, his voice soft with wonder. "We're going to give you everything," he would whisper, and Ifeoma would close her eyes against the tears, unsure if she was crying from happiness or shame. Probably both. Grief and relief are closer cousins than people realize, and sometimes they visit at the same time, sitting on opposite sides of your heart, making you feel split down the middle. Chaik started researching baby names, filling notebooks with options organized by meaning and origin. He cleared out the spare room they had been using for storage, talking excitedly about cribs and color schemes, asking Ifeoma's opinion on things she had no right to have opinions about, because the baby was a phantom, a wish dressed as reality. Her mother called one evening, having heard the news from Chaik's mother who had heard it from Chaik himself, and the pride in Mama's voice was almost unbearable. "Ah, Ifeoma, you've done well. A baby. This will fix everything. You'll see. Men become different when children arrive. They become men." Ifeoma wanted to scream into the phone that nothing was fixed, that everything was actually more broken than before, that she had solved loneliness by creating a bigger problem. But instead she said, "Yes, Mama. Thank you, Mama. Pray for us." Because what else could she say? That she had lied her way into her husband's arms? That the child everyone was already celebrating didn't exist? Some truths are too ugly to speak aloud, so we swallow them and let them rot inside us. The church community rejoiced with them. Mother Blessing, the pastor's wife who organized the women's fellowship, pulled Ifeoma aside after service one Sunday and pressed a bag of baby clothes into her hands. "From when my own children were small," she said, her face glowing with genuine warmth. "God is faithful. He restores what the enemy tried to steal." Ifeoma accepted the bag with a smile that felt like it would crack her face, nodding at the blessing, the prayers, the prophecies about a healthy delivery and a child who would be great in the Lord. Every word of encouragement was another stone in the wall she was building around herself, and she could feel the structure growing taller, more elaborate, more impossible to dismantle without everything collapsing. But lies are demanding creatures. They need constant feeding, constant maintenance, constant adjustment to accommodate reality's intrusions. When Chaik suggested they visit the hospital together for her next checkup, Ifeoma's heart seized. "No need," she said quickly, manufacturing a smile. "You're so busy with work, and these early appointments are just routine. The doctor says everything looks perfect. She even said the baby's heartbeat is strong." The lie had learned to elaborate itself, growing details like branches, each one another handhold for potential exposure. Chaik looked disappointed but accepted her explanation, and Ifeoma added guilt to the growing collection of emotions she carried like stones in her pockets. She began researching pregnancy obsessively, not to prepare for motherhood, but to prepare for performance. She learned what symptoms should appear at what weeks, what cravings were common, what physical changes she should be displaying. She started eating more, letting her clothes fit tighter, touching her stomach with the protective gesture she had seen pregnant women use. She complained of morning sickness that never came, fatigue that was actually just the exhaustion of maintaining fiction, and food aversions she manufactured from internet articles. Chaik accommodated everything. He made ginger tea for her nausea, took over household chores when she claimed to be tired, avoided cooking fish because she said the smell made her sick. His care was exquisite and heartbreaking, and Ifeoma found herself falling in love with him all over again, even as she hated herself more with each passing day. Their intimacy returned, but it was different now, softer, more careful, wrapped in his concern for the baby. He touched her like she was precious and fragile, and sometimes in the dark, Ifeoma would lie awake beside him listening to his breathing and think about confessing. The words would form themselves in her mind. "Chaik, I need to tell you something. There is no baby. There never was. I was lonely and desperate, and I thought a lie could save us." But then he would shift in his sleep, his arm would drape across her protectively, and she would feel the warmth of being wanted again, and the confession would die unspoken. "Tomorrow," she will tell herself. "I'll tell him tomorrow." But tomorrow keeps moving further away, like a horizon that recedes as you approach it. 6 weeks into the lie, Chaik's sister visited from Abuja. Ngozi was sharp-eyed and direct, the kind of woman who noticed everything and commented on most of it. She studied Ifeoma over dinner with an expression that made sweat prickle at the base of Ifeoma's spine. "You're not showing at all," Ngozi observed, and though her tone was casual, the words landed like an accusation. Ifeoma forced a laugh. "It's still early. Everyone carries differently. My doctor says everything is progressing normally." Ngozi hummed, non-committal, and changed the subject, but Ifeoma felt the weight of scrutiny, the sense that her performance was being evaluated and found wanting. That night, lying in bed, Chaik mentioned casually that his mother wanted them to visit for a traditional blessing ceremony. "She's so excited about becoming a grandmother," he said, his voice warm in the darkness. "She's already talking about the naming ceremony, about what family name we should pass down. I told her we'd come next month." Next month. The words sat on Ifeoma's chest like stones. By next month, she should be visibly pregnant. By next month, the lie would require a bigger costume, a more elaborate performance. How long could she maintain this? How many months could she fake before biology made a liar of her lies? The trapped feeling that had driven her to lie in the first place began returning, but this time it was different. Before, she had been trapped in loneliness, in a marriage that felt like a beautifully decorated prison. Now she was trapped in a lie that felt like quicksand. Every movement to escape only pulled her deeper. She had wanted to feel seen by her husband, and now she was seen, but only as the vessel for a child that didn't exist. She had wanted to matter again, and now she mattered, but only as a symbol of the future, not as herself. The irony tasted bitter. She had fixed nothing. She had only traded one cage for another, and this new cage was entirely of her own construction. Sometimes at night, she would go to the spare room that Chaik was transforming into a nursery and stand in the doorway watching him paint, measure, and plan. His joy was so pure, so uncomplicated, and she envied it even as she knew she was its architect. "You've got this," he would tell her when she expressed worry about being a good mother, and she would nod and smile while inside she screamed that there was nothing to have, no child to mother, just a woman drowning in a lie that had grown too big to contain. But she said nothing, because some prisons, even the ones we build ourselves, feel safer than the freedom that requires confession. And so Ifeoma stayed silent, watching the nursery take shape, feeling the lie grow inside her like the baby that wasn't there, both of them feeding on her fear, her hope, and her terrible, desperate love for a man she had forgotten how to be honest with long before she ever whispered those two world-changing words, "I'm pregnant." There is a particular exhaustion that comes from living a lie, not the physical tiredness of long days or sleepless nights, but a soul-deep weariness that settles into your bones and makes every interaction feel like a performance you're not sure you remember the lines to. Ifeoma discovered this exhaustion intimately as weeks stretched into months, and the lie that had felt so manageable in its infancy grew into something monstrous and demanding. 3 months into the fictional pregnancy, her body should have been changing in ways she couldn't fake. The internet told her she should have a visible bump by now, that her breasts should be tender and swollen, that strangers should be starting to notice and offer unsolicited advice about everything from what she ate to how she stood. She began wearing looser clothing, artfully draped fabrics that suggested a curve without committing to one. She stuffed small pillows under her dresses when they went out in public, adjusting the padding to match what 3 months should look like, then 4, then 5. The physical deception was exhausting enough, but it was the mental gymnastics that truly wore her down. Every conversation became a minefield. Every question required calculation. When church friends asked about her next scan, she invented appointments at private hospitals, showing them downloaded ultrasound images she'd found online, pointing to shadows and saying, "That's the baby's heartbeat," with a confidence that nauseated her. When Shaik's mother called asking for updates from the doctor, Ifeoma recited fabricated medical advice about nutrition and rest, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. But Shaik was the hardest audience. He watched her with the attention of a man in love, which meant he noticed things, small things, inconsistent things. One evening, he came home with a pregnancy book he'd bought, pages already dog-eared and highlighted. "It says here that at 4 months, you should be feeling movement. Flutters, they call it. Have you felt anything?" Ifeoma's mind raced. "Yes," she said quickly. "Yes, just small things. Like butterflies. It's hard to describe." She placed her hand on her padded stomach with what she hoped was maternal tenderness. Shaik's face lit up with wonder, and he immediately placed his own hand there, waiting, hoping to feel what didn't exist. The silence stretched as they sat like that, his palm warm against her lies, and Ifeoma sent up desperate prayers to a god she wasn't sure was still listening. "Maybe the baby's sleeping," she finally said, and Shaik laughed, kissed her forehead, and said, "Our shy one." The medical appointments became her greatest challenge. Shaik had stopped accepting her excuses about going alone. "I want to be involved," he insisted, and there was hurt in his voice that made her feel like the worst kind of monster. "I want to see our baby on the screen. Hear the heartbeat. I've missed too much already." So Ifeoma did what desperate people do. She invented obstacles. She scheduled fake appointments for times when Shaik had unmovable work commitments, then came home with stories about what the doctor said, what measurements were taken, how perfectly everything was progressing. She forged medical reports using templates she found online, her hands shaking as she filled in dates and fabricated statistics. The deception had evolved from a single lie into an entire false universe that required constant maintenance and expansion. But lies are like cracks in a foundation. You can plaster over them, paint them, pretend they're not there, but they weaken the structure nonetheless. And Shaik, for all his joy and excitement, was not a fool. Small doubts began appearing in his expressions, questions he would start to ask and then swallow. One Saturday morning, Ifeoma woke to find him on his laptop, and when she approached, he quickly closed the browser. "What are you looking at?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. "Nothing," he said, but she had seen enough to recognize a pregnancy forum, discussion threads about symptoms and timelines. He was researching, comparing what she told him to what other women experienced, measuring her story against reality and finding it wanting. The tension began building like pressure in a sealed container. Shaik would comment on how small she still looked for 5 months, and Ifeoma would respond with explanations about her body type, about how her doctor said some women barely show until late in pregnancy. He would suggest they switch to his company's health insurance that covered a premium hospital, and she would deflect, saying her current doctor knew her case, and she didn't want to start over with someone new. Each deflection added to his suspicion, and each suspicion added to her panic, and the whole structure of their renewed intimacy began to feel fragile, like a house of cards in a room where someone had just opened a window. Then came the evening that everything shifted. They were at a dinner party hosted by one of Shaik's business associates, a celebration for another couple who were also expecting. The wife, Adiz, was 6 months pregnant, genuinely pregnant, and her belly was unmistakable, round and prominent under her fitted dress. She and Ifeoma ended up in the kitchen together, and Adiz's eyes kept drifting to Ifeoma's carefully padded midsection with an expression Ifeoma couldn't quite read. "How far along are you?" Adiz asked. 5 months, Ifeoma replied, her smile feeling like plastic. Adiz nodded slowly. You're so small. I was huge by 5 months. Couldn't fit into anything. The back pain was unbearable. She paused, then added with casual precision, which hospital do you attend? Maybe we have the same doctor. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in evasion. Ifeoma dancing around specifics while Adiz pressed with the polite persistence of someone who smelled something wrong but couldn't quite identify what. By the time they returned to their husbands, Ifeoma was sweating despite the air conditioning, and she saw Adiz lean close to her husband and whisper something that made him glance at Ifeoma with barely concealed skepticism. The drive home was quiet, Chaik's hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw working like he was chewing words he wasn't ready to speak. That was nice, Ifeoma offered weakly. Was all he replied, and the sound carried oceans of unspoken questions. That night, after Chaik had fallen asleep, Ifeoma stood in the bathroom staring at her reflection, at the padding she had strapped to her body, at the stranger looking back at her with hollow eyes. It's okay to feel overwhelmed, she told herself, but the reassurance felt empty. Nothing was okay. She had created a fiction so elaborate it required supporting cast and props and constant vigilance, and she was exhausted beyond measure. The loneliness she had tried to fix with lies had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape, becoming the isolation of someone who cannot be truly known because she has buried herself under layers of deception. She missed being real. She missed the simple integrity of truth, even painful truth. But she had traveled so far down this path that turning back felt impossible. How do you confess to a lie this large? How do you tell a man who has been painting a nursery and choosing names and imagining a future that none of it is real? The next morning, Chaik's phone rang during breakfast, and Ifeoma heard him speaking with someone from his office about a package that had been delivered there by mistake. Her stomach dropped when she heard him say, "Medical records? But I didn't request any medical records." She watched the color drain from his face as he listened, watched his eyes find hers across the table with an expression she couldn't identify. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. He ended the call slowly, set down his phone with deliberate care, and said in a voice that was too calm, too controlled, "Ifeoma, we need to talk." The walls she had built so carefully around her lie began to crack, and through those cracks, truth started seeping in like water into a failing dam. Chaik had done what any concerned husband might do. He had contacted her supposed doctor's office to inquire about setting up a joint appointment, to surprise her by showing he wanted to be involved. But there was no file under her name, no record of her visits, no pregnancy being monitored. The secretary had been confused, apologetic, certain there must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. Just a lie that had finally grown too heavy to carry, and a woman sitting across from her husband, watching the last moments of her beautiful deception crumble into dust. "You've got this," she had told herself so many times, but she didn't have this, had never had this, had only been pretending while reality waited patiently for its turn to speak. There are silences that speak louder than shouting, and the silence that filled the room after Chaik's words was deafening. It was the kind of quiet that precedes earthquakes, when all the birds stop singing and the air itself seems to hold its breath, waiting for the ground to split open and swallow everything whole. Ifeoma sat frozen, her coffee cup halfway to her lips, watching her husband's face cycle through emotions like weather patterns crossing a landscape, confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief hardening into suspicion, suspicion finally settling into something that looked like grief. He didn't yell. Somehow, that made it worse. Yelling, she could have handled it. Yelling would have given her something to push against, a storm to the weather. But this terrible, measured calm was something else entirely. "Explain it to me," Chaik said, his voice so level it sounded like he was discussing a business transaction rather than the implosion of their marriage. "Explain how there's no record of you at the hospital you've been telling me about for 5 months. Explain the appointments that never happened. Explain." His voice finally cracked, and that small break in his composure was somehow more devastating than if he had screamed. "Explain how you could look me in the eyes every day and lie about carrying our child." The last word came out jagged, and Ifeoma watched a single tear slide down his cheek, tracking through the stubble he hadn't shaved that morning, and she understood in that moment that she hadn't just lied about a pregnancy. She had stolen something far more precious, his joy, his hope, his trust in the fundamental reality of their shared life. The truth, when it finally came, tasted like ash in her mouth. "There is no baby," she whispered, and saying it out loud after months of pretending made it more real than it had ever been. "There was never a baby, Chaik. I lied." She watched him flinch as if she had struck him, watched him stand abruptly and pace to the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with the effort of holding himself together. Why? The question was barely audible, and Ifeoma realized he was crying now, not the loud sobbing of theatrical grief, but the quiet, steady tears of someone whose foundation has just crumbled. Why would you do this to me? To us? And there it was, the question that required her to excavate all the pain she had been burying for years, to pull out the rotting core of their marriage and display it in the morning light. Because you stopped seeing me, she said, her own tears flowing freely now, months of suppressed anguish pouring out. Because I was drowning in our marriage and you didn't even notice. Because we became strangers who shared a bed and a surname, but nothing else. Because I was so lonely, Chike. So desperately lonely I could barely breathe. And you were right there, but you were gone, and I didn't know how to reach you anymore. Her voice rose despite her efforts to control it. You came home late every night. You stopped touching me. Stopped talking to me. Stopped looking at me like I mattered. And I tried everything. I cooked your favorite meals. I dressed up. I initiated conversations you shut down with not now, and I'm tired. I tried so hard to make you see me again, and nothing worked. Nothing. Until I lied about being pregnant, and suddenly you were back. Suddenly I mattered. Suddenly you cared. Chike turned from the window, and his face was a landscape of pain. So this is my fault. You lied to me for 5 months, made me fall in love with a child that doesn't exist, had me planning a future built entirely on fiction, and this is somehow my fault. His voice was rising now, anger finally breaking through the shock. You could have talked to me, Ifeoma. You could have said, Chike, we have a problem. Our marriage is dying, and we need to fix it. You could have suggested counseling, therapy, anything. But instead you chose to lie. You chose to manipulate me. You chose to make me the fool who painted a nursery for a ghost. I did try to talk to you. Ifeoma was standing now too, years of swallowed words finally finding their voice. Every time I tried to have a real conversation, you shut me down. Every time I asked what was wrong, you said nothing. Every time I reached for you, you pulled away. You think I'm the only liar in this marriage? You've been lying too, Chike. Lying by omission. Lying by silence. Lying by pretending everything was fine when we both knew it wasn't. She moved toward him, desperate for him to understand, even as she knew understanding wouldn't undo what she had done. What was I supposed to do? How was I supposed to compete with whatever has been taking you away from me? Is it work? Is it someone else? What happened to us, Chike? When did we stop being partners and start being performers? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither had been willing to face. Chike's anger seemed to deflate, leaving behind something more complicated, a mixture of guilt and grief and exhausted recognition. You want to know what happened? He said quietly, sinking into a chair as if his legs could no longer support him. I got lost. In work, in expectations, in the pressure of being the man everyone needed me to be. My father built nothing and left us with nothing, and I swore I would be different. I would build something, provide something, be someone. So I worked myself into the ground trying to prove I was worth something. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that you married me, not my ambition. I forgot how to come home and be human instead of just a provider. He looked up at her, and his eyes were red-rimmed and raw. But Ifeoma, even with all that, even lost and stressed and failing as a husband, I never lied to you about something fundamental. I never manipulated your emotions or created a false reality for you to live in. No, Ifeoma said, her voice breaking. You just let me starve while you were right there at the table. You just let our marriage die of neglect while you pursued success. You just made me so invisible I had to invent a pregnancy to be seen. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing now, all pretense of control abandoned. I'm not saying what I did was right. God knows I'm not. I'm saying I was desperate, and desperate people make terrible choices. I'm saying I love you so much it's killing me, and I couldn't figure out how to make you love me back. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I just wanted you to look at me the way you used to. Like I was enough. Like I mattered. And for a few weeks, you did. And it was so beautiful, Chike. Having you back was so beautiful I didn't care that it was built on a lie. They stood in the wreckage of their marriage, two people who had hurt each other in different ways, who had both been victims and perpetrators, who had loved each other into a corner neither knew how to escape from. Chike moved toward her slowly, and for a moment Ifeoma thought he might embrace her, might say they could work through this, might offer the forgiveness she didn't deserve. But he stopped just short of touching her, his hand hovering in the air between them before falling back to his side. I need time, he said, and his voice was hollow, emptied of everything but exhaustion. I need to think. I need to understand what's real anymore. You, me, us. I don't know what any of it means now. Where will you go? Ifeoma asked, though part of her already knew. Chike was already moving toward their bedroom, already packing a bag with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose mind has detached from the task. My brother's place. Maybe a hotel. I don't know. Somewhere I can think without. He gestured vaguely at her, at the home they had built, at the life that now felt contaminated by deception. I just need space, Ifeoma. From you. From this. From everything. He paused in the doorway, his bag in hand, and looked back at her one last time. You're right that I failed you. I did. I got lost, and I left you alone, and that's on me. But what you did, that's on you. And I don't know if I can forgive it. I don't know if we can come back from this. I don't even know if I want to try. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the apartment like a death knell. Ifeoma stood in the sudden emptiness, in the silence that was somehow louder than any argument, and she understood that her lie hadn't saved their marriage. It had simply revealed how broken it already was. They had both been drowning, just in different waters, and neither had known how to throw the other a lifeline. Now they were both sinking, and the worst part was that she couldn't even say which one of them had let go first. Time, they say, heals all wounds, but that's only half true. Time doesn't heal. It simply creates distance between you and the moment of breaking, and what you do in that distance determines whether the wound closes cleanly or festers into something permanent. 3 months passed after Chaik walked out. 3 months of Ifeoma living in an apartment that felt haunted by the ghost of what they had been. She moved through rooms where phantom conversations still echoed, where the nursery Chaik had painted stood as a monument to hope built on sand. She couldn't bring herself to dismantle it. Not yet. It felt like erasing evidence of a crime she needed to remember committing, a reminder that good intentions mixed with desperation create poison, not medicine. Chaik stayed with his brother for 2 weeks, then moved to a serviced apartment in Victoria Island. He sent money for bills without fail, answered her texts with polite brevity, agreed to meet for coffee once when she begged. That meeting had been stiff and formal, 2 lawyers negotiating a settlement rather than 2 people who had once promised forever. He asked how she was doing with the detachment of someone inquiring about a distant acquaintance's health. She asked about his work with the same careful distance. They were strangers again, but worse this time. Strangers who had seen each other's ugliest truths and found them unforgivable. When she reached across the table to touch his hand, he pulled away gently but definitively, and that small withdrawal told her everything his words hadn't. He was done. They were done. The marriage was a corpse they were both too tired to bury properly. But here's what nobody tells you about rock bottom. Sometimes it's exactly where you need to land before you can finally stop falling. Alone in her apartment, Ifeoma was forced to confront the woman she had become. Not the wife performing for her husband's attention, not the liar maintaining an elaborate fiction, but the raw, unvarnished self she had been running from for years. She started attending therapy, something she should have done before the lie, before the loneliness calcified into desperation. Her therapist, Dr. Adebayo, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a directness that left no room for self-deception. You made a terrible choice, Dr. Adebayo said in their 3rd session. But terrible choices don't make you a terrible person. They make you human. The question now is, what are you going to do with this lesson? What Ifeoma did was excavate herself. She journaled obsessively, filling notebooks with truths she had been too afraid to speak aloud. She wrote about her childhood, about parents who had modeled a marriage of duty rather than devotion, about learning early that women's needs came last, that suffering in silence was virtue, that asking for what you wanted was selfishness. She wrote about meeting Chaik and thinking he was different, about the early years when love felt easy and sufficient, about the slow erosion she had witnessed but not named. She wrote about her own failures, how she had stopped pursuing her own dreams to support him, how she had shrunk herself to fit into his expanding ambitions, how she had mistaken her own disappearance for sacrifice. And she wrote about the lie, dissecting it with surgical precision until she understood its anatomy. It was born from loneliness, fed by fear, sustained by the desperate belief that being wanted was the same as being loved. She also did something harder. She reached out to the people she had involved in her deception. She called Chaik's mother and confessed everything, enduring the older woman's shocked silence and eventual condemnation. She went to church and told Mother Blessing the truth, returning the baby clothes with an apology that felt insufficient but necessary. She contacted friends who had celebrated her fake pregnancy and told them there was no baby, never had been, and she was sorry for making them complicit in her lie. Most responded with disappointment or distance. Some were surprisingly compassionate. But all of it, every difficult conversation, every moment of public shame, was necessary. She was learning that redemption requires witnessing, that you cannot heal what you keep hidden in darkness. Meanwhile, Chaik was doing his own excavation. His brother, Emeka, had been asking questions Chaik didn't want to answer, Questions about what had driven his wife to such desperate measures, about what role his own absences had played, about whether self-righteousness was a comfortable place to hide from uncomfortable truths. She lied, Emika. She lied for months. Chike kept repeating, as if saying it enough times would make it the whole story. But his brother, 10 years older and twice divorced, just shook his head. And you disappeared emotionally for years. You want to keep score? You want to measure sins and see whose pile is bigger? That's fine. But it won't fix anything, and it won't make you feel better. It'll just make you right and alone. The words haunted Chike. He found himself thinking about the years before the lie, about how he had buried himself in work to avoid facing the emptiness of his marriage, about how much easier it had been to blame stress and timing rather than confront his own failures at intimacy. He thought about Ifeoma's desperate attempts to connect that he had dismissed as neediness, about conversations he had ended before they could become uncomfortable, about the way he had touched her, when he bothered to touch her at all, with obligation rather than desire. He had wanted to be a good man, a successful man, a man his father hadn't been. But in pursuing that abstract ideal, he had forgotten how to be a good husband to the actual woman he had married. 6 months after the confrontation, Ifeoma sent Chike a letter. Not a text, not an email, but a physical letter delivered to his office, her handwriting careful and deliberate across pages that smelled faintly of her perfume. She didn't beg him to come back. She didn't make excuses for what she had done. Instead, she wrote, I lied because I was drowning and I forgot how to ask for help. I manipulated you because I had lost faith in honest connection. I created a fake pregnancy because I couldn't figure out how to resurrect a dying marriage with truth. I was wrong. Completely, devastatingly wrong. But Chike, we were both wrong. We both let our marriage starve while standing in front of a feast we were too proud or too scared to acknowledge. We both chose silence over honesty, performance over authenticity, comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. My lies were just louder than yours. She continued, I'm not writing to ask for another chance. I'm writing to say I'm sorry, truly sorry, not just for the lie but for all the ways I contributed to the distance between us. For making myself small instead of demanding you see me. For accepting crumbs and calling it a feast. For losing myself so completely I thought a fake baby was the only way to matter again. I'm in therapy now, doing the work I should have done years ago, learning how to ask for what I need, learning that love without honesty is just elaborate loneliness, learning that I deserve to be chosen, not just tolerated, and learning that the same is true for you. She ended with this. If we're done, and we might be, and that might be right, then I want you to know I don't hate you. I understand you now in ways I couldn't before. We both got lost. We both failed each other. And we both deserve partners who see us, truly see us, and choose to stay anyway. Whether we can be that for each other after everything, I don't know. But I wanted you to have the truth. All of it. Finally, honestly. No performance. No pretense. Just what is. Chike read the letter 3 times, sitting in his car in the office parking lot, and found himself crying for the first time since he had walked out. Not from anger or betrayal, but from recognition. She was right. They had both been drowning, both been lying in different ways, both been too proud or too scared to say, I'm scared, and I'm lonely, and I don't know how to fix this, but I need help. He thought about the man he had become, successful by external measures, but bankrupt in the ways that mattered, unable to be vulnerable, unable to be present, unable to offer himself honestly, because he had spent so long performing strength instead of acknowledging his humanity. 2 weeks later, Chike showed up at the apartment. Ifeoma opened the door to find him standing there, not with flowers or grand gestures, but with his own notebook, his own pages of excavated truth. I've been in therapy too, he said without preamble. And I've been thinking about what you said, about how we both got lost, about how I made you invisible. He paused, his throat working. I'm not here to say everything is fixed or that we should just pick up where we left off. I'm here to ask if you want to try something different, something honest, something where we both show up as we actually are instead of who we think we should be. They sat at the kitchen table where everything had unraveled months before, and this time they talked differently. No accusations, no defensiveness, just 2 broken people examining the pieces of what they had been and asking if those pieces could be reassembled into something new. Chike admitted that his workaholism had been a way to avoid intimacy, that success was easier to pursue than vulnerability. Ifeoma admitted that she had enabled his absence by never demanding better, by making his comfort more important than her own needs. They talked about expectations, his from his mother about what husbands should provide, hers from her mother about what wives should endure. They talked about the silence that had killed them slowly, about how they had both become experts at avoiding difficult conversations. I don't know if we can fix this, Ifeoma said finally, honestly. I don't know if trust can grow back after I burned it so completely. Chike nodded. I don't know either. But I know we can't fix it by pretending the past didn't happen or that we weren't both responsible for the mess. And I know that if we try again, it has to be different. Real therapy, not just individual, but couples counseling. Real conversations, even when they're uncomfortable. Real presence, not just cohabitation. He reached across the table, not to take her hand, but to lay his palm open beside it. An offering, not a demand. And it has to be a choice we make every day, not just a promise we made once and assumed would sustain itself. They didn't reconcile that day. Reconciliation isn't a moment. It's a process, messy and uncertain and requiring the kind of courage that feels impossible until you attempt it. But they began. Slowly, carefully, with the caution of people who had learned that love without truth destroys everything it touches. They attended counseling weekly, learning to speak languages of honesty they had never been taught. They practiced asking for what they needed instead of expecting mind reading. They practiced saying, I'm scared, and I need help, and I don't know without shame. They practiced being human with each other instead of performing roles they had been assigned by culture, family, and their own fears. A year later, they were still married, still working, still learning. The nursery had been converted to a home office where Ifeoma was building a small consulting business, reclaiming dreams she had abandoned. Chike came home at reasonable hours, not because Ifeoma demanded it, but because he wanted to, because he had learned that success without connection was just expensive loneliness. They touched each other now with intention, with presence, with the understanding that intimacy requires showing up honestly. They fought sometimes, real fights about real things, not the silent treatments and passive aggression of before. And when they made mistakes, which they did regularly because humans do, they named them and worked through them instead of burying them until they rotted. Their marriage would never be what it had been in those early, naive years when they thought love alone was sufficient. It was something different now, more honest, more fragile, more aware of its own mortality. They knew now what they hadn't known then. That marriage is not a destination but a practice. That love is a verb requiring constant action. That truth is the only foundation strong enough to build on. And they knew that Ifeoma's lie, terrible as it was, had been the fire that burned away everything false, leaving only what was real enough to survive the flames. Sometimes, the wisest thing a person can say is, I don't know, but I'm willing to learn. And sometimes, the bravest thing a couple can do is start over while staying together, building something new from the rubble of what they destroyed. And so the story ends, not with perfection, but with honest imperfection, not with easy answers, but with difficult questions courageously faced. Ifeoma learned that lies, even those born from love, destroy what they claim to save. Chike learned that silence kills as surely as deception. Together, they learned what too many discover too late. That marriage without truth is just two people performing loneliness together. That love requires the courage to be seen fully, and that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what actually matters. The deepest truth? We are all capable of both profound love and profound damage, sometimes simultaneously. The question is whether we'll do the uncomfortable work of facing ourselves honestly, of asking for what we need, of rebuilding when we've been destroyed. That work is never easy, never finished, never perfect. But it's the only work that matters. Thank you for sitting with us in Story Cave today, for witnessing this painful, hopeful tale of two people learning to be human together. If this story stirred something in you, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a tale, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild trust after betrayal? What did you learn? Your stories matter. Your journeys matter. And remember, honesty is terrifying, vulnerability feels like weakness, and truth often hurts before it heals. But they're still better than the alternative. Always. Till the next story, stay wise, stay kind, and keep your light burning.